Next up, so we are running a few minutes behind in the program, but it won't take me as long to close us out at the end of the day, so we will make our reception timing for food and drinks. But yes, I'll welcome the next panel discussion hosted by Allison Chen from EGBC. So if Allison and her panelists can make their way up here. And just an anecdote from my fire at the lake story. It was interesting because I was interested in getting an appraiser up there in August, and the lake was then burning down. The lake community was then burning down in August, and then I was having this conversation with Peter and his panel in a prep phone call or prep meeting, and the discussion was, if the appraisers did come now that the fire has burned, would the value go up or down because of the damage or the fact that the burn has happened, so it's probably not likely to burn again in the next 5-10 years, perhaps? Allison, thank you. Over to you.
Jessica, thank you very much. Thanks for having my panel and me here today. Instead of talking about earthquake hazard or risk in general, I'm going to give a quick overview of microzonation mapping, and then I'll introduce my panel and get right into the questions as soon as we can. So at a fundamental level, microzonation maps are a collection and an interpretation of seismological, geological, geotechnical, and geophysical data with the intent to figure out the variations in seismic hazard in a particular area. The hazards we typically map are amplification, landslide, and liquefaction. Landslide's actually new. And the mapping can range from susceptibility all the way to potential. And what that means is susceptibility for liquefaction, for example, would be based on soil conditions and water table. Landslide would also be based on soil conditions and slope. So based on those, you might have the same susceptibility in Prince George and Richmond or North Vancouver, but the potential based on the seismology and the ground shaking would be different. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention too is microzonation maps are not risk maps. They are hazard maps. Risk includes vulnerability of the people, structures, and infrastructure. So that's just important to keep in mind. Now, microzonation mapping has occurred for over 80 years. Starting in the 1940s, there were microzonation maps for amplification. And over time, as science and technology and our knowledge about earthquakes has increased, so too have the maps. So more data has been collected, more complicated and detailed analyses and mapping have been done. You can see the different kinds of maps have increased as well. So there are some liquefaction maps, mostly focused in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. But we're not the only place in Canada with complex geotechnical and geological conditions. So there are actually microzonation maps elsewhere in Canada, Ottawa, and these are amplification based. So liquefaction is relatively new and landslide is very new. So yeah, Montreal, Ottawa, St. Lawrence Lowlands, and Quebec City. Oh, and sorry, in the code, amplification has been included in the code since 1965. So we're hoping maybe basin amplification will be included there more detailed and specifically in the future, but we'll talk about that in a bit. When we talk about microzonation maps, it's hard to picture if you haven't seen them or haven't used them. Microzonation mapping projects are usually a suite of maps. This is a small subset of potential maps that can be made because there's a different level of detail. So again, there are susceptibility maps and there are potential maps. So those at the top half of the columns, those are based on just the geological and geotechnical conditions, and at the bottom, you apply the seismic factor and see what the actual potential is, what the actual hazard is, based on the different annual excidence probabilities. There also are steps to create microzonation maps, and they all start with the geology, so those are often mapped as well as resources. Maybe you haven't used them that yet, but there are a lot of potential for the use of microzonation maps, and that's where a lot of my panelists come from today. You can have structural engineers, geotechnical engineers, local authorities, emergency management, risk modelers. There are lots of different uses, so I'm not going to get into that, but I'll let my panelists talk to it. The last slide I'll show here, on the left-hand side, is a photo of the Georgia, or a map of the Georgia Basin. And it's hard to tell exactly where it is. And the reason is because there's no agreed upon way to map it. So there are different parameters you can use to try to understand where it is. So what you can see here is there's a vertical cross-section and a horizontal cross-section, and those are centered on basically Richmond, Delta, and Vancouver. You might recognize the southern half of Vancouver Island as well, just to see where that is. So you can see the depth there in the white. That's trying to show the basin location, and that's based on the VP, or the P-wave velocity. On the right is the scope of the MetroVancouver Seismic Microzonation Mapping Project, which hopefully you've heard of. That's something that the University of Western Ontario is working with ICLR and EMCR and EGBC. The first phase started in 2017. They're working on a suite of about 30 maps that will be released in the spring of next year, or March next year, so early next year. They range in, again, kind of like the maps that I showed, VS30, amplification, liquefaction, etc. They go from West Van to Coquitlam to Surrey and Delta. And then phase 2, which is an expansion project, will come in 2026, and that includes Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, and Langley. I've talked a little bit about the mapping project, and I want to get into the questions and the application of the microzonation maps as soon as I can. One thing I do also want to mention is that Engineers and Geoscientists BC is involved, because we've been helping with the peer review process of the development of those maps, and also working to create professional practice guidelines. And those are to create some consistency in both the development of future maps, because there are no guidelines on it. It's all, to date, mostly state-of-the-art academic exercises. So trying to put some consistency there and professional practice considerations for the development of the maps, and also use. So there are a lot of users who maybe haven't used them in the past, structural engineers, geotechnical, local authorities, just because they weren't available or they didn't know about them. So we're trying to put that out there and help them get used as best as possible. So here's the panel. I don't have any nice pictures of my panelists, which maybe they appreciate. You'll see there are 5 names up there. We were hoping to have Sherry Molnar, who is the lead project mapper for the MetroVancouver Seismic Microzonation Mapping Project. She couldn't be here today, but she did help us out with some of her thoughts, so we'll try to incorporate some of that into our panel discussion. I have Tamsin Mills. Tamsin comes from AdaptationCollaborative. She comes with a local authority perspective. She's an expert in natural hazard planning, climate change adaptation, and resiliency. We have John, who's a structural engineer from Ausenco. He has been on the standing committee for earthquake engineering for 20 years. He was the chair for 10 years. And he was involved in the NBC 2015 and 2020 incorporating damping and base isolation into the code. So he's well versed in this seismic and structural business. And then Carlos, last but not least, is he's an assistant professor at UBC in structural and earthquake engineering, and he is in charge of the engineering seismic resilience lab. So with that, let's start our questions. Hello? Okay, so why are people talking more and more about seismic microzonation maps? What are your expectations related to the MetroVancouver Seismic Microzonation Mapping Project and the complementary EGBC professional practice guidelines?
Wow, they both looked at me. I'm the token planner, so I'll start. Well, I think that I'll start with the microzonation maps, and I think they provide significantly better information for us on seismic hazard. And in theory, and I believe in practice too, more information is better. Will help us make better land use decisions and make better risk management decisions. And in terms of the guidelines, they outline how local authorities can start to use these maps, and also lay out how municipalities could undertake doing this mapping, which is really important to get coverage across seismic hazard areas. And I'll pass it to John.
Thank you. So from a structural engineering perspective, these maps are going to be really, really valuable for when we're starting to do desktop studies. A lot of times early in a project, a client may not have the budget, time, availability to retain a geotechnical engineer or do site investigations, and this will provide us access to a huge amount of data to help with those desktop studies. Then from the EGBC guidelines, these are going to be very important to help all of us in the room to know how to use the data and how not to use the data. And there's going to be very good guidance on the limitations of how we use that data. So I think it's an excellent complement to the actual maps.
Do you want to add something?
No,
Carlos?
I think they conveyed that.
Okay.
Well.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. I think it's really going to be important to know how to use the maps. What is an appropriate way to use them and what is not, because they're brand new, and we all know that using something for something unintended creates unintended consequences.
Maybe I'll just add from a layman's perspective that the maps really give us a sense of ground shaking intensity, liquefaction, and landslide susceptibility, and then also some potential. So I know you already said that, but I wanted to repeat it.
No, thank you. So the next question is, how have seismic microzonation maps been used in BC and Canada to date? So as you saw, there are some existing. So how have they been used? And how do you hope these new maps will be used, and where do you see the greatest potential for their use?
So maybe I'll start there. I think here in BC, we've seen some of these maps for major cities. We obviously have high seismic hazard, so in places like Victoria and Vancouver. But the existing maps typically focus on site class, so effectively categorizing the properties of the soil. So they might offer, extensive areas that have a site class A, which would relate to very, hard rock, all the way down to a site class E, which is very soft soil, to give you a sense of the relative shaking amplification that you might observe in different areas. That has been very helpful, but it's become a little bit obsolete because in the latest edition of the National Building Code of Canada, the 2020, now we don't use site class to estimate the seismic hazard. We use VS30, which is a measurement of the shear wave velocity in the top 30 meters of soil. And lucky for us, that's going to be one of the map products that's going to be coming out next year. I think the new series of map products, you saw some of the ones that are going to be coming out in the slides earlier, are going to include other site parameters like site period or basin depth, which are gaining a lot of significance. So there are going to be lots of opportunities there.
So just to add to that, as again, for the structural engineer for design of new buildings, as Carlos said, right now, the code allows us to use this VS30 parameter, which gives us much better design parameters than using the site class. So in many cases, it'll reduce the cost of the structural and earthquake design of buildings using that VS30 value. So that's where we're moving to. The difficulty is to get VS30 by code, you have to do a 30-meter borehole or a CPT. You got to do a physical test on site. Now, in the early days of a project, we can go to these maps and it'll give us an indication of that VS30. Are we in a site where there's high amplification, low amplification? So if you're a developer, you say, well, I've got 3 sites, you can say, okay, well, this site might be higher ground shaking than this site. This site might have liquefaction susceptibility compared to this site. And again, so there's going to be additional costs. If there's more ground shaking, the cost of your building will be higher. If there's liquefaction susceptibility, likely the cost of your building is going to be higher. So using of these maps early on with minimal, physical work on the site will allow you to make these comparable decisions, or even a decision about that one site. Are there going to be things that you don't, before you have to do these physical intrusions, you can get great insight into the potential cost and difficulties on your site.
Thanks, John. I think I'll answer the second part of the question, just untapped potential, and I'll answer it from a bit of a broader sense. I think, we've focused a lot on energy efficiency of buildings, and we need to focus more on the safety and resilience of buildings. And, we've had panels, a panel on heat, now one on seismic hazards. So how do we start to look at economies of scale in retrofitting across these different hazards? We have a lot of information, we have data, we know where some of these high-risk areas are now, or high-hazard exposure areas, and where the most vulnerable occupants are in those areas. So we can prioritize retrofits across multiple hazards and really try to find economies of scale to make that affordable still.
Thank you all, and thanks for talking about the retrofit and putting the risk assessment in there too. Okay, last time I pointed at the screen, which obviously didn't do anything. Okay, so I just want to bring it back to BC a little bit and some of the goals of this symposium, which is to bridge science, policy, action, all towards risk reduction. So I'm going to ask a question to Carlos first. What is special about the seismology and the geology of BC, particularly in the Lower Mainland around the Georgia Basin? Is this an issue elsewhere in the world? And what can we learn from research, practice, codes, and policies in other places?
Okay, I'll try to take one question at a time. So first, if we think about the seismology in Southwest BC, we're exposed to a range of seismic sources, so we can experience crustal earthquakes, intersab earthquakes, or interface earthquakes. So hopefully most of you have heard of the Cascadia subduction zone, right? 1,000-kilometer long fault from northern Vancouver Island to northern California that can produce up to magnitude 9 events. So we have a pretty complex tectonic regime that maybe is a little bit, harder to let's say, measure and understand than in other parts of Canada or other parts of the world. So that's on the seismology side. When it comes to the geology, if we think about the MetroVancouver region, a pretty unique challenge is the fact that we sit above the Georgia Sedimentary Basin. So Allison tried to show a little bit of an image or a graphic that characterize the extents of the basin. So these are very deep soil deposits that can amplify ground motion shaking. And currently, in our National Seismic Hazard Model, in our National Building Code, we don't explicitly consider those effects. There are a series of factors embedded in the calculations, but they don't fully address the specific issue that we're facing here. So that's, with regards to the seismology and the geology. In terms of this happening in other parts of the world, it definitely does. It's not just a BC issue or a Metro Vancouver issue, so we can look, to our neighbors to the south, for instance, in the city of Seattle. So they also sit above a basin. It's called the Seattle Basin. And they recognized that this was an issue, and in 2018, the city of Seattle issued a director's rule that effectively required that the design of tall buildings there follow a performance-based seismic design approach, had to explicitly account for this basin amplification effect. And the reason for that is because the amplification of ground motion shaking due to the basin typically affects long periods, so that essentially affects tall building seismic demands. So in their approach, they effectively required an amplification of shaking up to a factor of 2 at longer periods. So that's doubling the seismic hazard estimates that were coming from the Cascadia subduction zone. So we're not talking here about negligible impacts, right? We're talking about a considerable seismic hazard demand increase. And what they did in the US ultimately is recognize that this was an issue that they wanted to tackle at a federal level. So eventually they included these effects in their national seismic hazard model. So the latest one, 2018, is when they included it, and then now that's part of their actual building codes and standards. So they do include these effects. As for what we can learn, so the last little question, I think these are just examples of things we can do here in BC, right? So something like the city of Seattle. It's something we could do here in Vancouver if we wanted to account for these effects, or a provincial level with the BC Building Code, or maybe even at the federal level. So I think it's pretty important for the BC Building Code or the National Building Code to try and tackle these effects as soon as possible. It may be a task force that looks at some of the map products that are going to be released next year, which will include basin amplification, to look at those in comparison to what we're currently doing in the code, and maybe use that as a mechanism to accelerate the process of considering these important effects. Sorry, that was a very long answer
That
to
was
the
a
three
very
questions.
long question. That was very good. Thanks. John, would you like to add on?
Yeah, so from the code perspective, I said I've been involved with the code that sets the earthquake design provisions, and there's task groups within that. So I spoke to the chair of the seismicity task group within that, the Standing Committee on Earthquake Design. So as Carlos said, the NBC 2020 came out with a hazard. It had, it was just sort of implicit, minor component of basin effects. NBC 2025 is going to come out with no change to that hazard. So, 2025, it'll still be sort of, if you want to call it, old data. So Canada is behind the US on this. And so I think we do need to catch up. So I talked to him and I said, we really need to, it's going to be done for 2030, but 2030 is a long way off. But I think what we need to do is push to get perhaps, there's something called an interim, a code update between cycles, so maybe 2027-ish. Now, the way that can happen is, yes, if we have a task force here and we get information that we can help feed to that seismicity task group, the province has representatives at the highest level of the Codes Canada. They can make this a priority. So if those people make a priority, it'll filter down to that task group, and they will be mandated to make it a priority. And then any of us can submit what's called a code change request. We can go to the Codes Canada site and submit a code change request saying, I want basin effects explicitly included in the next code cycle. And the committee has to look at that, and they have to report to Codes Canada why we should or shouldn't do it. So there's a lot of avenues to get that done. Sherry Molnar is on that committee. That committee includes specialists from the United States that have advanced that. So I think we're behind the US. It's time for us to catch up.
I love it. John just gave you all an action item. We're looking for code change requests. And I just want to say, too, part of Engineers and Geoscientists BC mandate is to create professional practice guidelines, and that's to try to help bridge the gap and show what good professional practice might be. Sometimes it's a little bit above the code, sometimes it's helping interpret the code, sometimes it's about nothing related to the building code. But this is one of the things that the professional practice guidelines can do and say, it's not in the code, but we know basin effects can have a massive impact on particularly tall building design, so consider it. Consider it as best as you can, and talk to your clients and talk to your colleagues about the effects. All right, let's move on. Just kidding. Perfect. Not like you're probably looking at that. So how do seismic microzonation maps fit in with existing hazard assessments used in municipal risk assessments, land use planning and emergency management? And what do you see as the biggest challenge to local authorities? This one's for Tamsin.
Okay, I'm going to look at my notes because this is a long one. Thank you. So I do think we've been focusing on climate-related hazards recently at the local government level for good reason, and we've seen leaps and bounds when it comes to flood hazard planning, planning for extreme heat, etc. And if you look at the hazard risk vulnerability assessments across the region, and at the MetroVancouver IPRIM HRVA, Hazard Risk Vulnerability Assessment, you'll see that seismic hazard and earthquakes are in the top 5 always. So we need to complement our climate-related hazards with seismic hazards as well. So what can this improved understanding of seismic hazard do for us? Well, we can make better land use decisions. Where do we put critical infrastructure or people that may need more assistance in the event of an earthquake for evacuation? Where do we put density, and how are we equitably addressing exposure to multiple hazards? We can use it in building an infrastructure design. So we're going to have more awareness, as John pointed out, on where site amelioration or more expensive structural design may be needed. So we have a sense of that. We can understand where more detailed site analysis might be needed and how this might impact affordability while maintaining safety. Sendai framework, priority number 1 is understanding risk. This is hazard information, but with building information, social indicators, we can get a better sense of risk and where those higher risk areas are in our cities. Emergency management, understanding the hazard and risk can help us plan for earthquake response. So where might we need more debris management? Where are the routes that may be the most useful to use? And where might the hotspots be in terms of damage and casualties? And this is really helpful to input to exercises and to risk scenarios used by emergency managers. The biggest challenge, and this actually relates to the last panel, because in my experience, local governments prefer to disclose risk and hazard information when they have a plan in place to deal with it. And my knowledge of the Lower Mainland is that there are a few earthquake strategies and retrofit strategies, but not many. So it might be difficult for local governments. It might be a challenge to explain these hazard maps and put them out there without council having some direction on what to do next. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you. I realize we skipped question 4, so let's go backwards. And let's talk just a little bit more about the code. So we've talked a little bit about basin effects not being in the code, but I just want to talk about how seismic microzonation maps relate to the building code at all. What information can we get from one versus the other, and do they contradict each other, or are they complementary? I'll pass to John first.
Yeah, I was wondering, I made some notes for question 4, and I thought, something seems wrong here. Yeah, that's all right. Good. Yes, so we've talked about the national, the national building code sets the hazard for every latitude and longitude point in Canada. You can get that at every point in Canada by going to the Earthquakes Canada site. It's a national hazard model, and again, right now, you can find that hazard at any latitude and longitude by, again, getting that VS30, that shear wave velocity in the top 30 meters. It's a great hazard for the nation on average. What it can't focus in, and it's also based on a certain type of soil profile, because you have to assume something. So there's an average soil profile, and based on that, with the best data from earthquakes in the past, they've come up with hazard models. It cannot account for the regional differences, of a certain point in Surrey where the soil profile is different, the depth of and the gradation of the soil is different. And what these hazard maps will do is give us that early indication that might we be different from what's in the code. If we are, then we can do things like, right now there's something called site-specific response analysis. We can hire a geotechnical engineer to do a site-specific analysis that we may find that we can get hazard data that is less than the code. If we sense that there's a site that by doing this additional analysis we're going to get less than the code, this is becoming accepted by authorities having jurisdiction. And again, it's specific. And these are the kind of information that these maps will let us make these early decisions that, the code is great on average, but is there something unique about our area, both basin effects, site period, soil profiles, that we can learn from this and jump into these studies earlier to make better, decisions and get better designs of our new buildings, as well as the upgrades of our existing buildings.
Maybe can I just jump in? Because there's a little bit of contradiction here. We're talking a little bit about basin effects where, hey, our amplification might be a lot higher than we think, a lot higher than the code says we should design for. But in other cases, if you do a site-specific response, you get more specific. You know exactly what that site's going to do compared with the code, which of course has to make generalizations and put buckets together, and you design within a bucket. You might be at the high end, you might be at the conservative end, you don't know. So that's what microzonation can help with.
Yeah, so one quick comment before, there's going to be instances where it's going to be different than the code, and that's going to be expected. And that's why it's going to complement it by new data, and if it's contradictory, we're going to get to the bottom of it, and is it going to potentially reduce the hazard or increase it? So we're going to use that difference to help us. But just as an example, for example, I just had a recent project where we didn't have any data. We were in an early phase of a project. So we used data from a study nearby 10 years ago, site class. Okay, so you go to the code and you get a hazard. And we said, this just seems a bit odd. So we actually did a borehole to get VS30. Now we may not have to do it. It reduced the lateral load design for that building by 40%. So here's something where if you use old data, well, if that's all you have early on, and so using this, I just think it's going to give us better information early to get much more informed decisions. So for us, that was a huge win for us by getting that data early.
I guess I would just add that typically when these seismic microzonation maps are being developed, they're generally being carried out by academics and provincial governments. So it's important to highlight that they don't link or they're not included in these federal efforts to map seismic hazard throughout the country. So there's a little bit of a disconnect that's important to recognize. That said, in the map products that are going to be released, there are going to be parameters that can be used in some of the calculations that we currently do in the National Building Code, as John was alluding to, but there are going to be other parameters that you can't really use in the current structure of the code. So it's just important to recognize that.
Tamsin, did you want to add anything?
I think that they're a complement to the code. Vancouver building bylaw, of course, they could do more, but generally, and when we think about smaller communities, the capacity will rely on the code. But I think, as Carlos and John pointed out the other day when we were discussing this, all this hazard information helps us move the dial forward, helps us have these conversations that we need to have to change the building codes as we move forward in all realms of resilience.
Thanks very much. All right, this is our last or second last question. I do want to get to questions from the audience. And we have touched on this a little bit in passing, but I'll ask it directly. You'll see it momentarily. How can structural and geotechnical engineers incorporate the use of seismic microzonation maps into their typical workflow? How should they be used for design of new buildings or retrofits of existing ones?
Yeah, so again, I'll start on the structure. I think I've sort of covered most of this already, but I'll just reiterate some of the key ones. Again, we always start out with preliminary studies, conceptual design, and this is just better information to make better decisions early on. Seismic retrofit guidelines for schools, and Allison knows much about that. And again, we're using this VS30 data in those guidelines. And right now, the only way to get it is to do these boreholes on site. So in the early phases of doing these studies to find out how much is it going to cost to upgrade these schools, we'll be able to use some of this data to get us much more accurate information to make those decisions, to compare replacement school versus upgrading a school. So again, it's going to be really valuable data. And again, things that aren't included in the code, site period. We'll be able to start designing buildings so that the period of the new building is not going to be in resonance with the building or the period of the site. We don't have that information today. And so once we'll be getting information on site period as engineers, we can make sure a new building or a retrofitted building is not going to go into resonance, and which is not, it's not in our code today. It's getting into other codes around the world. So I just see a lot of opportunity to design better buildings earlier in the design process.
Thanks, John. I'm not a geotechnical engineer, but I'll try to fill that gap just for this panel today. And I can't reiterate enough, the guidance is the same. The use of microzonation maps is for early stages in a project. And for a geotechnical engineer, it can really help with scoping and budget, just knowing the general sense of what you can expect at a site from the maps, liquefaction, landslide, shaking. It can tell you where you need more information, and it can tell you the geological conditions and how to get more information. And just it's a great piece to add to the database of resources a geotechnical engineer has when scoping their project. And the data itself could be really useful too, hoping that gets published with the maps. All right, we've got a question already. So exciting. I just wanted to open it to the panelists in case you wanted to say anything, any last thoughts that you were really hoping someone asks about, or you can just hit it proactively before we pass the mic to the crowd.
I would just maybe two comments. One that has been made by John and Allison. The fact that these maps are going to be available, that doesn't preclude you from having to do in situ testing for real projects. So that is super important to know. Yes, they add value. Yes, they make things easier in earlier stages of a design. No, it doesn't mean you don't have to do that test anymore. You still have to go do that test. So I think it's important to put that out there. And then the other one that I think will really help move the conversation forward is the fact that there's going to be information on basin amplification, right? And I think that's going to help move the conversation forward. So those are two things that I think are worth highlighting.
Yeah, and again, just a last comment. The amount of data we heard earlier about open availability to data we heard in the previous panel session. So again, I hope all of you, when this comes out, you'll be talking to your partner at home about, the VS30 at my site is this, and my VS30 is higher than my neighbor, so that's a good thing, because then my shaking is less. So it just gives all of us ability to learn a bit more about this material.
I'll just add the anecdote that I spent a lot of time Googling and YouTubing VS30, site period, basin effect. So you planners, get on it.
Could I add one more thing?
Please.
I think it's just Sherry Molnar unfortunately couldn't be here today, but she's done a tremendous amount of work in order to produce these maps. So I just wanted to recognize that. And if you have very detailed questions, you should definitely contact her. And I guess I also want to point out that it's a little bit difficult to talk about these things not having the maps available because they haven't been released, but hopefully this helps you become aware of the amount of information that's going to come out. I, before the panel, thought this was just going to be, VS30, end of story, and then realized that there's going to be 20-something maps.
Yeah.
So it's been helpful to just be part of this process, but I could see how it's a little bit difficult potentially for you in the audience to think about these without seeing the maps. So thank you for putting up with this.
So following the Christchurch earthquake, there was a mandate put into consultants that they had to provide the geotechnical data to a mandatory repository database, and if they wanted to access that data, they had to provide data. So it was a reciprocal agreement that was mandated within their code. That currently doesn't exist in BC, and to be frank, I'm a bit frustrated that a provincial agency hasn't mandated that. Do you see that this is going to help that process, or is there anybody in the province in the room that's willing to give funds to do that?
I mean, I don't have an answer to the question, but I just want to echo your remarks, because one of the questions that I had for Sherry, but she's not here, is, in addition to the mapped products, are you going to release the data that led to the mapped products? Because as an academic and as a researcher, the map is great, but I want to know the underlying data and the assumptions that went into that. But I don't have the answer to that, so I'm just echoing your question.
I agree. And again, the beauty of these maps is there's going to be various layers, I think, that will be made accessible to various people. There's been huge collaboration. The data has been verified by boreholes. So, there's been a lot of giving from the community to verify that the data points that they're doing, are valid. At the next layer, it'll tell you how many, what's the spacing between data points. What's the, so there's a huge amount of data buried in here. And again, I think it's a good starting point for where you want us to go.
And maybe one thing I'll just add too is there is no mandate for it in the province. We have professional practice guidelines, or they will come soon too. And we're hoping and saying geotechnical engineers, maybe there's an opportunity for you to provide that to your local authority having jurisdiction. But that's kind of a proactive thing that on a local authority basis would have to set up.
I get the sense from the panel discussion and presentation that you see the value of the microzonation maps as mostly for new build. The word retrofit was mentioned there, but I think mostly it was a discussion about new build. But we see examples worldwide of major liquefaction disasters, Christchurch in 2011. So I guess my question would be, could you see the value of these maps for more proactive risk reduction or even managed retreat buyouts? Christchurch unfortunately had to wait for a major liquefaction disaster before they bought out 8,000 houses. So, is there a confidence level in these maps that could lead to proactive managed retreat?
Well, I mean, I can talk about my experience in 2012 releasing the first flood hazard mapping at the City of Vancouver. And so that's a while ago. That's over 10 years ago. And managed retreat came up immediately, as did buyouts, and we're 10 years later. And we are doing some more planning and looking at different options, and I think there might even be a panel tomorrow about retreat. I can't say that I'm optimistic that that's a near-term step. I do hope that they'll be used to consider retrofit programs and, across hazards, as I mentioned, where there's a lot of multi-hazard exposure in some of these areas.
Yeah, and sorry if we gave a misconception that it's focused on new builds. I mean, it's equally focused for retrofits. I mean, structural engineer, we get asked to do, what's the cost of a retrofit of this building? Well, we can't go and do a 30-meter borehole, but now we'll be able to get data and say, based on what we know, this is what the cost is going to be. These are the implications. Is there liquefaction potential here? Yes or no? And again, there's been a lot of advances in liquefaction on the schools program. The liquefaction potential away from shorelines and away from river edges, and the consequences are hugely different than near shoreline. So all that data is there. This just makes it more accessible. It sort of puts it in one place. Yeah, all that work is there, and it'll make it easier, for everyone to get that certain level of access. So yeah, equal for retrofits, absolutely.
And go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, I thought it was interesting in the previous panel, this notion of potentially including a climate risk index in, I guess, connected to assessment values of properties and so on. And this makes me think whether there's an opportunity to potentially try to do that. But of course, you could see the risks associated with that kind of approach. I mean, all in favor of sharing as much data as possible, but how you communicate that is of course problematic, right? And even though it's a lot more detailed than what you might find in a sort of national mapping approach, it's still different from what you might actually find at a site. So it makes it difficult to take it to that level.
And I'll just say two things. So I just want to reiterate, based on Carlos's comment, microzonation maps are not risk maps in themselves. They're hazard maps, but they can be applied in risk assessments, and they have actually in the past at a community level. There's an example in Victoria. There were one of the seismic microzonation maps was overlain with the building inventory to do exactly that, to see where the actual risk was based on population or building, the actual building inventory. So it's a huge opportunity for that sense. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tanya from the City of Victoria. Thanks for mentioning us. My question was about our seismic vulnerability assessment that you're talking about. And I guess that is a microzonation map with other layers included on it, which we have made public. And there's some mitigation strategies, but I'm wondering if we would have access to that, like the guide that you're talking about releasing with these maps for the City of Victoria, and would that include information that we could potentially present to our mayor and council and other organizations for encouraging those mitigation efforts?
Sure. So the guidelines that we've been talking about are high-level professional practice use of the maps. They don't go into the seismic retrofit, so those will come out in March. But we do have seismic retrofit guidelines that have been used for the Ministry of Education School Seismic Mitigation Program. So those guidelines are available to structural engineers who take the training. They were developed for schools, but they are a great performance-based resource for the assessment and retrofit of all low-rise buildings. So that could certainly be a resource. It is a different path than the code, so that's something to consider when you take on a project that way, but that's a really incredible way to retrofit your buildings.
Yeah, and again, I think, the BC Building Safety and Standards branch has endorsed, these retrofit guidelines for buildings 4 stories and less. I mean, it really is, the state of the art. It's more cost effective than code. It utilizes all the existing components of, or components of existing buildings that are archaic with, and lower capacity than new components. So, yeah, from 4 stories and less, I think we've got phenomenal guidelines in BC, and for 5 stories and higher, there's U.S. guidelines that we utilize again to optimize a retrofit. So there's very good guidelines out there. As we all know, retrofits need money. The schools program has built, the Ministry of Education has got billions of dollars to upgrade vulnerable schools. Gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could expand that to other buildings?
There's an incentivization panel tomorrow, so let's talk again.
I have a follow-up question, if that's okay. I'm just going to reflect back on something that I heard from the panel. So who's from local governments here? Just raise of hands. Okay. How many of you have capacity to take on a geotechnical database for all your data? Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight that we often push these things off onto municipalities and think they have the capacity to do so. Often, even just getting PDF reports of old data is impossible. And so this is why I'm asking, can we start to do this as a provincial mandate? Because this is a low-cost thing to do at scale and really important to do. If we're talking about risk reduction measures, this is cheap. Do this fast.
Yeah, I guess I would just react to that by saying that with the creation of the new Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness and this new provincial disaster risk and resilience assessment that's going to be undertaken over the next year, there seems to be a push to make as much data publicly available as possible. So I think in the context of that work and this new ministry, there are opportunities to really push for these things. Whether any one of us in the panel can do anything about that, I don't know. But I know there will be a presentation or a session tomorrow, I think, about that project in the new ministry. So maybe there are opportunities there to sort of emphasize the need for data and not just for data that's already existing, but to augment that data as we do more work and more studies.
Do a bit of a jog.
Okay, I feel like I have to speak up now. So, my name is Tina Neal. I'm Executive Director of Disaster Mitigation and Climate Adaptation at the new Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. So, one of Premier Eby's 100-day commitments was the launch of Climate Ready BC, which is not just climate change. We have seismic stuff on there too, but it is intended to be the kind of one-stop shop portal for information, data, maps, guides, whatever is needed by the disaster risk reduction community to do our collective work. So our plan is to put the maps onto Climate Ready BC. That site will be built out over time as new data and information becomes available. I wish Amanda Broad were here to speak a little bit more to what our seismic program plans are. Rhiannon, I don't know if you have any other things you want to add, but so that is definitely part of the work that we do. And yeah, happy to hear more recommendations that folks have on how to improve access to data and information, training, whatever. Our branch is new in the ministry, our division is new in the ministry, and it is really to focus on supporting and enabling disaster risk management.
Thank you so much. We are just about back on time. We're still a little bit over 5. Maybe, I don't know, we take one more question?
Yeah, he's ready for a beer.
Yeah. Okay, let's go. We'll talk after.
Thank you so much to my panel, these contributors, the great conversation.
Thank you so much, Allison. It was hard for me to not jump out of my seat and jump into a lot of those questions because this is such a huge passion project of mine as well. It was about circa 2012. I was working on the City of Vancouver earthquake strategy. We had no microzonation mapping, no citywide risk assessment. The Ottawa maps were coming out on the front page of the paper. Sherry's basin effects work was coming out on the front page of the paper. And so this is like basically 10 years later, seeing this all come to fruition is amazing. Oh, I will. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, again, just a huge amount of gratitude for everybody who showed up tonight. I promise tomorrow we have a lot more breaks embedded in the schedule. Today was a little bit crunched, so I do apologize for that. Tomorrow we are at the WASC Center, so not here. A huge shout out to the Partners for Action team, University of Waterloo. There's a small little army of them here helping out, making things happen. So huge thank you. Tomorrow we have several other panel discussions. We also have the Living with Water team that's running an interactive timeline mapping exercise. So that will also help us move about and get more movement into the program tomorrow, which will be much appreciated, I'm sure. We have the special BC government session tomorrow afternoon that Minister Ma mentioned, as well as the ERI BC APRE at Rogue. So that's the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute BC chapter dedicated to earthquake risk reduction in BC. And yeah, join us for a drink and some snacks and some music. And if you are just here for the day today, please do leave your lanyard behind. I'll send them back to the library so we can not have them in the landfill. And just again, a huge thank you to our sponsors, and we'll see you all tomorrow.